All modern football stadiums are ugly, soulless bowls, utterly devoid of character, charm, and personality. Bloody hell, that sure is a spicy take, Alfie. I know, right? It's almost like I've just set it up as an interesting premise to examine in one of my usual inane rambling videos, and I don't actually believe it. Look, the other day, my girlfriend sent me this tweet. I'll give you a second to read it, please excuse the French. Then she came downstairs, we both work from home, and said, "It's true though, it really looks like an inkjet printer." Then she asked why modern stadiums look like that, and I corrected her that the plural of stadium is in fact stadia, even though I, like everyone else, also say stadiums because stadia sort of sounds odd, just because I like to be difficult. She has subsequently left me. Fortunately, only for a couple of weeks. I mean, you can hardly blame the girl. That is just a brief glimpse into what it must be like to live with me. Honestly, who wouldn't need a break at some point? But not without planting the seed of a video idea in my mind. Say what you want about girlfriends, but every now and then, they will accidentally say something that inspires an idea that you can monetize for content. So today, thanks to her, we are starting a discourse. Why are modern football stadiums so ugly? It is a complaint that you read and hear a lot. Why do they look, in some people's eyes at least, like inkjet printers, toilet seats, and aeroplane hangars? If that's too subjective, after all, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, why do modern football stadiums all look the same, lacking the character, quirks, and uniqueness of old grounds? Regardless of your taste in terms of aesthetics, that is a critique which is almost ubiquitous at this stage. But is any of it actually true? And if so, why? Well, that's what today's video is all about. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey from Barcelona to Brasilia, and just about everywhere else in between, as we take a deep dive into modern football stadiums, why they have such a bad reputation, and whether any of it is truly deserved. 6 weeks ago, I watched England lose the Euro 2024 final in Berlin. No, this isn't a therapy session. That game was played at the Olympia Stadium, first constructed for the 1936 Olympics, and majorly renovated during the first half of the 1970s and the 2000s, ahead of Germany hosting 2 World Cups, and doubtless, it is one of, if not the most impressive stadium I have ever visited and been inside, and I'm fortunate to have been to quite a few. The exterior is grand, imposing, and instantly recognisable. The 2 narrow towers at the front of the stadium, which, literally, tower over the stadium's turnstiles and support the famous Olympic rings, mark the Olympia Stadium out as a true landmark of Berlin. The grandiose yet simple exterior of the Olympia Stadium is typical of the type of neoclassicism that was idolised by the Nazis. The inside of the stadium is the same. It's a sea of limestone, granite, and travertine for as far as the eye can see, with grand staircases and sprawling galleries overlooking the stadium's gardens to transport you to your seat. The expanse of tan and cream travertine almost makes you feel as though you are inside of an ancient colosseum, which is, of course, the whole idea. And then you get to your seat. For a start, you're about as far away from the pitch as Elon Musk is from his kids, due to the massive running track that surrounds it. The pitch, that is, not Elon Musk. I've been to several stadiums with running tracks, and particularly behind the goals, none of them feel as distant from the action as the Olympia Stadium. And then, well, if you're me, there is a massive handrail directly in your line of sight, obscuring, when sat down, literally most of the pitch. Obviously, I would have been happy to stand all game before anyone says it, but there was a group of Mexican children sitting behind us, and I'm not a monster, even if they were supporting Spain. You could chalk that down as mere bad luck, it happens to the best of us, but at the Olympia Stadium, this is not a rare occurrence. Whereas at almost every other stadium at the Euros, a restricted view seat might have meant that there was a tiny speck of glass covering a quarter of a corner flag, otherwise the view was flawless. At the Olympia Stadium, this wasn't even listed as a restricted view seat. No, at the Olympia Stadium, you have to literally not be able to see any of the pitch, whether sitting or standing, in order for it to qualify as a restricted view. And I'm only half joking. There are plenty of seats, with next to no view of the pitch at all. What is the point of all this, Alfie, you may be wondering? Well, compare and contrast that with, well, you could pick any one of them, but let's just say the Allianz Arena in Munich, which was built from scratch ahead of the 2006 World Cup. The Allianz Arena does not leave the same impression on you as the Olympia Stadium. It's impressive, don't get me wrong, the entire exterior lights up on a night, it's big, basically the same size as the Olympia Stadium, and it is immaculately appointed. But in a haze, you could be forgiven for confusing the inside of the ground with the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium in London, the Puskás Arena in Budapest, or the Strawberry Arena in Stockholm. The same goes for almost all modern arenas. The Tottenham Hotspur Stadium is a masterpiece and an architectural marvel, but it is a marvel, principally, of functionality. The fact that all modern stadiums tend to look alike in that sense is no coincidence. The priorities of clubs when building new stadiums are things like capacity, sightlines, accessibility, safety, maintenance cost, and, increasingly, multi-use capabilities, not aesthetics, character, or individuality. The best formula to meet all of those priorities is a blueprint which has been repeatedly replicated, with only occasional upgrades and innovations. Just take the work that is currently being carried out on the Camp Nou in Barcelona, one of the world's largest and most iconic football stadiums. A lot of people are upset, or at least somewhat perturbed, by what the Camp Nou will look like when Barcelona return there in December, after almost 2 years away. This thread, by someone who calls themselves the Cultural Tutor and has 1.7 million followers on Twitter, which has been seen almost 10 million times, describes the transformation as a tragedy. The grievance is a simple one. Before the transformation, the Camp Nou was iconic and unique, but once Barca return there, it will look just like every other modern stadium. The Cultural Tutor even created an accompanying image of several similar-looking stadiums to illustrate his point, or her point, who knows, before going on a long diatribe about disregarding tradition and the failure to preserve heritage, and on the face of it, it's difficult to disagree. There is a charm and a majesty about that, which there simply isn't about that. But this is, quite literally, a very narrow view of the renovations of the Camp Nou, specifically, an aerial view. Many modern football stadiums simply look very similar because they tend to have roofs for obvious reasons. The open-top Camp Nou, with only one covered stand, might make a lot of us feel all warm and tingly inside. Not like that. But it also makes a lot of Barcelona fans feel, I think the technical term is piss wet through every time it rains, and blinded every time that the Catalan sun shines bright. In other words, it's not very practical. And the same goes for a lot of aspects of the Camp Nou before Barcelona temporarily moved out, which had become majorly outdated, which is why the renovations are very popular, and are considered long overdue, by most match-going Barcelona fans. No one cares more about the heritage and tradition of FC Barcelona, and by extension the Camp Nou, one would imagine, than Barcelona fans themselves. Yet it is those exact same Barcelona fans, and specifically, their 150,000 paid-up socios or members, who technically own the club, who voted in favour of the ongoing renovations. What's more, from the air, the new Camp Nou, or the Now Camp Nou if you will, might look like a whole host of other modern stadiums. I mean, there is only so much that you can do with the roof, I suppose, but from ground level, it's an entirely different story. Previously, as those of you who have visited the Camp Nou will know, despite being a monumental stadium in a beautiful city, many aspects of the stadium's exterior at ground level were relatively nondescript. Following the renovation works, that is no longer the case. The post-works Camp Nou is, I think, pretty stunning, or at least striking, interesting, and not at all generic at ground level. Nor will it be inside the stadium, where the heart and soul of the old Camp Nou, it is hoped, will be preserved, just with a much-needed facelift and modernisation. Bloody enormous, isn't it? If you put this up against this, it's easy to paint a story of betrayal and all modern stadiums looking alike, but if you put this up against this, or this versus this, It tells a very different story. Interestingly, the Camp Nou, both pre- and post-renovation, is extremely similar to the Estadio Benito Villamarín, which is currently scheduled to undergo major renovations between 2025 and 2027. I mean, it's seriously striking just how similar they look from the air, and it somewhat undermines the idea that the Camp Nou is totally novel or unique, as that popular Twitter thread by the cultural tutor alleged. You see, much as it is a legitimate criticism, I think, of modern stadiums, that they are generic and most of them look very alike, what this criticism tends to overlook is the fact that most stadiums built in the same era, for the exact same reasons, they are looking to maximize efficiencies using the best known practices and technologies of that time, tend to be generic and look somewhat alike. Heck, most of Britain's most iconic stadiums, Anfield, Highbury, Celtic Park, Goodison Park, Hampden Park, Hillsborough, Ibrox, Old Trafford, Stamford Bridge, Villa Park and White Hart Lane were literally all designed by the same bloke, the Scottish architect Archibald Leitch, who rose to prominence during an era of mass stadium building as the popularity and financialisation of football exploded, and as a result, most of them had very significant similarities and uniformities when they were first built. It's the same story with the Camp Nou. When the Camp Nou first opened in 1957, it was a very functional stadium, which, like the Santiago Bernabéu in Madrid, was based heavily on De Kuip in Rotterdam, the home of Feyenoord, which was revolutionary in its design when it opened in 1937. What made the Camp Nou unique, insofar as it could be claimed that it was unique at all, given the similarities with the Estadio Benito Villamarín among other stadiums, was its two major renovations in 1982 and 1994, and other very similar stadiums and designs that were built during the same era becoming obsolete. In that sense, the Camp Nou's ongoing renovations follow in that tradition, building upon the history of adaptation that has made the Camp Nou such an iconic ground. If I showed you a photograph of the Camp Nou when it first opened, which I will do, it wouldn't be immediately recognisable to most people as the Camp Nou. If I showed you Anfield or Old Trafford when they were first built, arguably the two most iconic existing club stadiums in English football, unless you're a history buff, you probably wouldn't even be able to identify them. Everything has changed. It's like Trigger's broom, for any of you who may be familiar with Only Fools and Horses. Trigger, who works as a road sweeper, claims that he's maintained the same broom for 20 years, before revealing that it has had 17 new heads and 14 new handles. In philosophy, the same paradox is known as the ship of Theseus, pondering whether an object is the same object after having all of its original components replaced over time, typically one after the other, but, I prefer Trigger's broom. It's the same story with football stadiums. Nothing of the original Anfield or Old Trafford still remains, but we still think of them as being old, historic and traditional grounds, full of nostalgia and sentimental value, contrasted with the soulless bowls that have been built from scratch. In actual fact, though, it is just a case of a stadium being rebuilt bit by bit, or all at once. In either case, everything which is old is eventually torn down, and something new is erected in its place. When we look at older stadiums, they seem quirkier, more interesting, and more unique, and broadly speaking, they are, but that's because we're talking about a body of stadiums built over a period of more than 100 years, not just in one era, and gradually renovated and adapted over time, making them a mishmash of different eras and, inherently therefore, less generic than a bunch of stadiums built in one era. Modern stadiums, by contrast, and by definition, were all built in the modern era, and are therefore relatively similar, like all stadiums built during the same era, but they haven't had the time to be chopped, changed, and remoulded in the same fashion. So, it's true to say that the Emirates Stadium in London, which has been the home of Arsenal since 2006, is remarkably similar to the Estadio da Luz in Lisbon, which has been the home of Benfica since 2003. Of course it is. They were built by the same architects just a few years apart, and Arsenal used the Estadio da Luz as the blueprint for the Emirates. Allegedly, on PES 2011 and PES 2012, since they didn't have the image rights for the Emirates on the game, Arsenal played their home games at the Estadio de Luz, and nobody noticed. For obvious reasons. But it's also true to say that Ibrox Stadium in Glasgow, which has been the home of Rangers since 1899, was remodelled as practically a carbon copy in many ways of the Westfalenstadion in Dortmund, home of Borussia Dortmund since 1974, during the 1970s. Yet no one in their right mind would say that the problem with stadiums built or developed in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s or 70s is that they are all soulless and generic with no individual character or personality because they're just replicas of other stadiums, even though it is almost as true of those eras as it is now. I say almost, and it is here that a concession does have to be made, because all those stadiums built during the same era, and in the same region, have always tended to be fairly uniform. That has been exacerbated in the case of modern stadiums. Due to globalization, we now see less variation between stadiums in different countries, continents and climates than we used to, where, for example, Northern European and Southern European stadiums used to have very different styles due to weather conditions, and South American stadiums even more different still. Now the biggest and most expensive stadiums everywhere in the world follow a very similar blueprint. Football has become even more profit or revenue driven, with matchday revenue providing a key factor, driving teams to maximise their stadium's earning potential, and thus leading many of them to the same conclusions and solutions. And thankfully, which is why we see so many fewer stadium disasters now, there have never been such strict safety and building regulations with football stadiums, which also forces a degree of uniformity. In those unique ways, modern football stadiums are especially generic and sameish. In every other sense, 'twas always thus. We always like to think that the present day, the time in which we are currently existing, is somehow special, whether for good or bad, when, invariably, as Mark Twain put it, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. There is also a degree to which it just takes time for stadiums to grow on people. Sticking with the Camp Nou, which just seems to be the perfect case study in so many ways, it was fairly controversial among many Catalans when it was first built. A lot of Barcelona fans were nostalgic about their old ground, Les Corts, feeling that the Camp Nou lacked the same history and grandeur, and they couldn't see the point in the move. Now, of course, the Camp Nou is one of the most iconic stadiums in the world, vital to Barcelona's status as a super club, and it is adored by most of their supporters. This isn't just true of football stadiums, it is worth noting. Most major architectural projects take a bit of time to endear themselves to the public. The Eiffel Tower and the Louvre Pyramids in Paris, now two of the most iconic landmarks, not just in Paris, but in the entire world, were despised by many locals when they were first erected. Many Parisians considered the Eiffel Tower to be a giant monstrosity, towering over the otherwise elegant and picturesque French capital, and wanted it knocked down. Meanwhile, the Louvre Pyramid received scathing criticism due to accusations that it didn't fit in with the historic buildings which surrounded it. Few people now argue that either should be torn down. If you're thinking, well, sure, Alfie, but that's the French. They complain about everything. Let me point you to another landmark of Barcelona, the Sagrada Familia, the world's largest unfinished Catholic church, which was designed by renowned Catalan architect Antoni Gaudí. The Sagrada Familia was reviled for decades after its construction first began, during the 1880s. Send Gaudi and the Sagrada Familia to hell, read Pablo Picasso's review. Meanwhile, George Orwell once described it as, quote, one of the most hideous buildings in the world, and bemoaned the fact that the anarchists didn't destroy it during the Spanish Civil War. The Sagrada Familia still divides opinion. Anything this unusual is bound to, but it also now has vast numbers of admirers, attracts millions of visitors every year, and again, you would be hard-pressed to find even many of its most extreme critics who would actually advocate for tearing it down. Likewise, the Guggenheim Museum was hated for its unusual design by many New Yorkers when it opened in the late 1950s. The Dancing House in Prague was lambasted by locals when it opened in the 1990s, who felt that it wasn't in keeping with one of Europe's best preserved and most historic cities. And even the Vienna State Opera, or the Wiener Staatsoper in German, was denounced when it was constructed during the late 1860s, with locals claiming that it didn't compare to Vienna's previous opera house which it had replaced. One of the opera house's two architects, Eduard van der Nul, was so troubled by the criticism that he took his own life before the venue opened. Meanwhile, the other architect, August Sickard von Sickersberg, died of tuberculosis just 10 weeks later. The Vienna State Opera is now considered a marvel in the heart of Vienna and is one of the most famous and iconic opera houses in the world. I actually went there last summer, and while, to be totally honest with you, I don't think that opera is for me, or at least not that one, I am clearly uncultured swine. It is remarkable to think that there was a time in which that building drew intense criticism and was considered ugly and lacking in grandeur compared to its predecessor. I mean, seriously, just look at the thing. There are many such examples though. Instant classics are rare in architecture, and the critics always have the loudest voices. And whilst it is unlikely that in 20 years' time, the Pirelli Stadium will be considered an architectural marvel and the eighth wonder of the world, maybe the Hangzhou Stadium in China, opened in 2018, or the Estadio Nacional Mané Garrincha in Brazil, opened in 2013, will, although, admittedly, it would help if either of them had regular occupants who could fill more than 10% of their seats, and the latter wasn't rapidly falling into a state of disrepair, but you get the general idea. We also fool ourselves if we think that our view of a stadium is dictated solely by aesthetics and architectural merit. The Vienna State Opera is stunning, but one of the reasons why it is so iconic is because of the role that it has played in the cultural life of Vienna for over 150 years, and the operas and composers it is associated with, such as Richard Strauss, who was the principal conductor at the Vienna State Opera for 5 years, and debuted some of his most famous operas there. Likewise, the San Siro in Milan isn't just famous for its aesthetics. If you built it now, I imagine the design would receive its fair share of criticism, not least the roof, which was added in the late 1980s, but because of the history of Inter and AC Milan, two of Europe's finest footballing institutions, the 1934 and 1990 World Cup, Euro 1980, and 4 European Cup or Champions League finals that it has hosted, among many other things. All of that gets tied up in the aesthetics when we think of a stadium like the San Siro or the Camp Nou in a way that is practically impossible to disentangle. Aside from anything else, the San Siro has just been such a key part of the Milan skyline and cityscape for so long now that it feels as much a part of the city's cultural heritage as the Milan Cathedral or the Galleria Vittorio, which is why there is such intense opposition to tearing it down. New or modern stadiums, by definition, obviously don't invoke the same emotional response or sense of nostalgia, and won't do until they are no longer new and modern and have built up the same memories, associations, and sense of sentimentality. You can already see this happening with some stadiums. When the new Wembley first opened in 2007, there was still a lot of nostalgia for the old Wembley, the Twin Towers, and the majesty associated with a stadium that Pelé once described as the cathedral of football, the capital of football, and the heart of football. The new Wembley couldn't hope to instantly replicate that gravitas, but 17 years since it opened, it is building its own legacy. As a Hull City fan, the Wembley Arch, which replaced the Twin Towers as Wembley's iconic emblem, is now tied up with all of the memories of Dean Windas's volley against Bristol City in the playoff final, us winning our first ever semi-final, and therefore reaching our first ever final of the FA Cup, and a Mohamed Diame wonder goal sending us back into the Premier League, as well as all of the England memories, of course. It was there that Wayne Rooney broke Bobby Charlton's record as England's all-time leading goal scorer. England reached their first major tournament final since 1966, and in 2022, the England women's team became the first England team, male or female, to win a major tournament in over half a century. It was there, in other words, that football finally came home. Lots of Man City fans still miss Main Road, but the Etihad has become synonymous with that Aguero goal and an era of unprecedented success. The Allianz Stadium may look relatively small and sanitised to neutrals compared to the Stadio della Alpi, but it is adored by Juventus fans who despise the Della Alpi and associate their new ground with their 9 successive Scudettos in the post-Calciopoli era. And the King Power Stadium may lack much of the charm of Leicester's old ground, Filbert Street, and be basically indistinguishable from Southampton's St Mary's, Derby's Pride Park, and Middlesbrough's Riverside Stadium, which were all built during a similar era. But for Leicester fans, the King Power Stadium is where their club lifted the Premier League title, completing one of the greatest underdog stories in sporting history, and it is that which distinguishes it from St Mary's, Pride Park, or the Riverside, not the metal girders or the tons of concrete. I want to end this video by returning to the Olympia Stadion. Not literally, of course, although you can watch me actually visiting the Olympia Stadion and giving a quick history of it in my Euro 2024 final video over on my second channel. The Olympia Stadion, as I said at the very beginning, is one of the most memorable and impressive stadiums I've ever visited. But would I want to be a season ticket holder there? As majestic as it undoubtedly is, there are so many reasons why I wouldn't. The Merkerspiel Arena in Dusseldorf, by contrast, which I went to a few times during the Euros, is maybe one of the most uninspiring stadiums in the world from an aerial vantage. I mean, look at it. It looks like an aeroplane hangar or some kind of exhibition centre. It couldn't really be much less inspiring if it actually tried. But inside, of course, and even at ground level, the Merkerspiel Arena doesn't look like that. It is spacious, immaculately appointed, and has a brilliant hybrid indoor and outdoor feel about it. Practically every seat in the stadium offers a perfect view of the pitch, and, helpfully, the pitch isn't in a different postcode to the stands. The stadium is serviced by a tram system which actually goes all the way into the stadium grounds and was, at least as far as I could tell, the only efficient one that rapidly got fans in and out of the ground in Germany. As a one-off experience, the Olympia Stadion is a joy, and I would recommend anyone to go and visit it. But as a season ticket holder, you'd far rather go to the Merkerspiel Arena every week. There is no comparison. And the dichotomy between the two, in many ways, represents the dichotomy between old and new stadiums and why, whilst from the air, they might appear, or indeed may actually be, quite generic and tedious, that isn't always the case from the perspective that actually matters, that of the fan that goes every week, nor does it mean their architectural merit doesn't appear from other angles. There is a certain art in utility. That's not to say, of course, that modern stadiums should be free from criticism. This poster, and my girlfriend, are right, the new Santiago Bernabéu does look a bit like an inkjet printer, and a lot of modern stadiums are generic and, for now at least, have a degree of soullessness as a result. What's more, I don't think that has to be the case. It is possible to build, fundamentally, a functional stadium which resembles a lot of other stadiums due to the same best practices being deployed and them serving very similar purposes, while still retaining some degree of character and uniqueness. The Wembley Arch, which isn't actually purely cosmetic, it serves a vital purpose in supporting the stadium's roof, but obviously, Wembley could have been constructed, like most other stadiums, without the arch. Like the old Wembley, though, with the Twin Towers, the FA wanted something distinctive and unique that would make Wembley iconic and instantly recognisable. Of course, most stadiums aren't as large and prestigious, nor do they have anything like the budget that it cost to build Wembley, but I think that every new stadium should aspire at least to have something which makes it interesting or unique. The Tottenham Hotspur Stadium isn't just functionally maybe the best football stadium in the world, they also made the effort to make its exterior not entirely without its own quirks and intricacies. Immense effort was put into the stadium's acoustics and layout, and the single-tiered 17,500 seat South Stand, on top of which sits Tottenham's famous Golden Cockerel, is the largest stand in the UK, creating a unique feel and atmosphere. Anyway, that's my contribution to the discourse. If you ask me, the ugliest stadiums, in Britain at least, are probably actually those that were built during the wilderness of the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s. When Scunthorpe's Glanford Park opened in 1988, it was the first new Football League stadium in 33 years since Southend United moved to Roots Hall way back in 1955. The following year, the Hillsborough disaster and the subsequent Taylor report forced clubs to either majorly renovate or build entirely new stadiums. Between Glanford Park being built in 1988 and, I would say probably, Huddersfield's move to the Kirklees Stadium in 1994, which played a large part in spawning that new generation of what we might call modern stadiums, with the likes of Middlesbrough, Sunderland, Reading, Southampton, Leicester, Hull and many others, all taking inspiration from it, you got a spate of stadiums like Chester's Devon Stadium, Northampton's Sixfield Stadium and Warsaw's Bescott Stadium, which lack the sort of history, tradition, charm or grandeur of genuinely old stadiums, while also lacking a lot of the modernity, practicality and functionality of the new wave of modern stadiums built from the mid-90s onwards. But, that's a whole other discourse for another day. I actually quite like some of them. There is charm in anything if you look hard enough. Please don't come at me in the comments, Northampton fans. I know that there are a lot of you who watch. Anyway, that really is it for today's video. Apologies if my voice has sounded a little bit off. I was at Ellen Road for Hull City Away yesterday, and we all get carried away sometimes, don't we? But anyway, yeah, hit the like button if you enjoyed today's video. Obviously, I hope that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure, it goes without saying at this stage. So why do I keep saying it? Who knows? But do make sure, in case it doesn't go without saying, that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on, not just for this channel, HITC Sevens, but also my second channel that I mentioned earlier on, Alfie Potsama, both of which should be about to appear or already be appearing on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might fancy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram or Threads by the username @HITC Sevens on all three, should you wish to do so. And all of those links, plus a whole lot more, should be down in the video description below. Cheers!